I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a plenitude of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives and monthly and annual new music wrap-ups.
Mm-hmm.
However, today, Tom and I want to discuss a subject very near and dear to our hearts. Tom, what makes an album great? Is it any one magical criteria? But before we get started, you guys can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcasting device, and you will automatically get our latest podcast episode sent to your device each week. Also, Velocities in Music does not want your money. We also don't want to introduce ads into this podcast quite yet. Right now, all we want is for you guys to share Velocities in Music with family or friends in your life whom you think would benefit from joining in on the music discussion we try to create each week. So, Tom.
Yes.
What makes an album great?
Wow. Well, that's a very open-ended question.
It is.
Where to begin?
It is, but we try to answer this question almost every week. Everything that we talk about in this podcast comes down to this like never-ending search that you and I are on to find the perfect record.
That's true.
And while like we've filmed or recorded ourselves reviewing music for years now, and we've given some perfect quote, I'm air quoting here, perfect album scores out there. Have we ever discovered a perfect record? Does that exist? And I think that we have to approach I think approaching this topic from the idea that this is a quest. Yeah. That we're trying to find the perfect record. And what does that mean? What are we looking for?
Sure.
Like that will help us get there. And a general disclaimer I'd like to start with, Needy, is that our definition of what a perfect record is and how we go about that might be different and vary person to person.
Definitely. Well, that's what makes this quest, as you say, this journey so difficult, is that this standard, this definition is going to change from person to person.
Right.
So are we looking for, albums that are perfect to each of us? Because I think that we already have some of those determined. We've found some that to us, we wouldn't change a damn thing. They hit every musical need that we're really looking for in a great listening experience. But if the question is we're looking for, a more authoritative, objectively perfect album that we would just say from some kind of mathematical or statistical standpoint, I don't know how you'd want to look at it, we can actually qualitatively say is perfect. And I don't know if something like that out there exists, but I think that there are definitely going to be some albums that seem that way to a larger sample of the population.
Right. Now, we have reviewed music. We've been considered, we called ourselves music reviewers. Now, in the podcast form, we're not really reviewing music as much. I mean, we do give the monthly wrap-ups and stuff. And then certainly in that vein, we can't shake the music reviewer inside of us. Yeah. So we're naturally just evaluating albums as we go. Sure. And I would say that I'm definitely looking for those gems. Yeah, I want to find those really great, and I do consider it a quest for the perfect album. But we read a lot of music reviews. Yeah. And a lot of other music reviewers, like, they're obviously looking for something. But what are they looking for, and how does that differ from like what I think we look for? Before we dive into that, like, what do you think that they're looking for? Well,
that's a good question, and actually that's something that frustrates me about reading a lot of other reviews, is that I don't feel like a lot of reviewers make that explicit. If I'm going into an album review and a reviewer doesn't like the album that they're reviewing, they'd better damn well tell me why, but that even isn't enough. They also need to tell me what should have been there that wasn't. And I think that that's where a lot of people fall short, is they can say, oh, well, this album sucked. Well, why? What did it not do for you that you wanted it to do in order for it to be a great album? Because that's important to me. Because I'll get on sites like Pitchfork or AllMusic, and I'll read reviews of albums that I love, that I would consider, damn near perfect maybe, and they don't like them. And so obviously there's a disparity there. There's something that it's doing for me that it's not doing for them. And it frustrates me to no end when I come out of that experience, when I stop reading that review, get to the end of it, and I don't feel like they actually justified their stance. And I think that it's because a lot of people take for granted this notion that we have to make our own definitions and biases transparent to others if we're able to have any kind of conversation around this at all. But a lot of reviewers, I feel like, get I don't know if they're just all up in their own heads. I don't know if it's kind of an egocentrism thing, but it just like they think that people should just know what they're looking for. Well, I don't.
Yeah.
So,
well, and the other thing is, I think people just fall into the trap of saying, "Oh, music analysis is subjective, and it's all opinion based." And I think technically they have a point. It's true. I mean, everything about analyzing music is subjective. Now, we argue and have argued in the past that it's more than that, right? Like you can like an album I would consider terrible, Tom, like you have in the past. Like we've gone through this. You've loved albums that I think are awful.
Yeah.
And the point is you have to argue why.
Yeah.
Right. You're not gonna make a statement like this album is like you can't tell me I'm wrong for not liking it, and I can't tell you you're wrong for liking it.
Yeah.
But you're gonna have an argument as to why. You're gonna list a bunch of reasons, and you're gonna break your listening experience with that album down into different components, and then describe factors as to why that album succeeds.
Right. And an interesting point to that, Jake, is I think you're going to come to, during disagreements like that, I think is what I'm referring to, you're going to come to one of two conclusions. And I think both are equally interesting and worth exploring. One, you're going to find that the two people are just listening to the album completely differently.
Right.
It's almost like they're listening to different albums. They interpret things differently. You could have, I'm trying to think of a good example, but in general, just at a conceptual level, you could have an album where one person hears it as very emotive and one person doesn't feel it at all. Well, at that point, that's hard to capture. That's hard to quantify. How are you going to argue that?
I can actually think of an example between us.
Great.
In Rainbows. Radiohead's album In Rainbows.
Perfect example.
Yeah, because like that album to me, I love it. I think it's one of the best records I've ever heard.
Yeah.
And you like it, but I think you're more lukewarm on it.
That's a great example where I think that when you and I listen to that album, we're kind of hearing different things. It's hitting us so differently that our experiences almost can't be compared because, as people, I almost think that we just naturally assume that others are going to be in a similar frame of mind as us. And so when we listen to an album, and when I sit and listen to In Rainbows with you, and we know that sonically, physically, scientifically, we're hearing the exact same thing, it just goes to show that the music, while being a constant variable, the listener is such a varying variable. That seems like kind of an odd phrase, but that really the experiences can be completely different. And it's on the end of the listener, not the end of the music. But the other option I wanted to mention is what's funny is when you have disagreements, but really the people agree more than you'd think. We could talk about an album that maybe I like and you don't like, and we could very much have the exact same things to say about it. It's just that one value that I find as being qualitatively great, you just don't like for the exact same reason.
Yeah, because in Rainbow's example, you and I both have listened to that album countless number of times since 2007 when it came out. And I think that you and I both have a very detailed understanding of the music that is presented there.
Exactly, yeah.
But the way we interpreted it, as you just said, is very different. And so for a long time, you and I have postulated that, while music is subjective and analysis of music and argument for or against a certain record has always been subjective.
Yeah.
There are ways of objectively approaching a record and making arguments for and against it based on your own personal biases, based on your own personal tastes.
That's exactly right. It can stay subjective, but you can break it down into more objective points that then you just define conditionally for yourself.
Right.
And I think that once you take the time to do that, the conversations that you can have with people become a lot more pointed.
Yeah.
And you can identify why you have such different experiences with the same record. The communication just becomes a lot more efficient and clearer. 6
years ago, actually right about this time in 2010.
Yeah.
It's January 2016 here in snowy Iowa and freezing cold Iowa. in very similar conditions 6 years ago is when we started Velocities in Music and we started doing album reviews.
Yep.
One of the things that the argument that we had put together at the time was exactly what we are describing. But I think that we needed, at least I needed, Tom, to actually figure out a way to theorize and numerically back what we were talking about. I have an accounting background, so I love numbers and I love statistics. I also love spreadsheets. So I figured out a way. I wanted some way to test Tom and my theory that we had developed, which is if you break down a listening experience into a bunch of different components of the listening experience, evaluate those listening experience, like rank them 1 to 5, each of those components of the listening experience, you could aggregate that rating, each of those individual attribute ratings, compare it against your own personal tastes, and you could inherently predict a score.
Right.
And this isn't anything new. A lot of websites out there, in fact, the algorithms you see like Spotify using for or Last.fm use it, or Pandora to find recommendations for you to listen to, music for you to listen to, are using much more advanced algorithms than what I'm suggesting here. This is something that's just very simple and more applicable to music discussion than I think suggestions for whether or not you would like an album. But it did force us to go through the exercise of dividing the listening experience into different components and attributes that we would evaluate kind of on an individual basis to start forming a larger opinion about an album. And back in the day when we were actually doing full album reviews, Tom, it was to develop a score. Right. Like we were scoring albums from, we would give it a score up to 100 being a perfect record, or quote, air quotes there, perfect record. But it was from 20 to 100. We never rated anything below a 20.
Right.
I mean, Bieber got 20. My World 2.0. I mean, it was implied in his album title, just 2.0, 20.
Just remove the decimal.
So
decimal.
Tom, what were some of those characteristics of an album? What were those different attributes?
Well, a couple things that we always look for is just songwriting, which is a very broad kind of label to throw on something. It's a very broad topic.
What is songwriting to you?
So songwriting to me, at its very basic, when you break it apart, is how are you constructing melody and chord progression? How do those go together? Now, that even becomes a little bit problematic because, there are a lot of ambient songs that don't necessarily have melody, ambient albums that aren't rich in melody. There are also a lot of, let's say, like hip-hop, for example, that doesn't necessarily rely on chord progressions as much. That's very true. Then it's maybe a little bit more rhythmic-based. So, and I think that rhythm plays a part of that as well, but really, to me, it's just that core of how can you take this song and, regardless of how you choose to present it, regardless of what instruments you're using to convey a chord progression or a melody, or what drums or items you're using to represent a rhythm, what is the heart of that song that no matter how you slice it, remains the same? And this is something that when you break it down to something that kind of vague and ethereal, it's really hard to define, because really at that point you could say, well, if you make it that basic, what makes any melody better than another melody? And that's really hard to argue.
That is really hard to argue.
But I think that there are some that, based on how we identify patterns in sound and what we hear, our environment, I think that there actually are different patterns, different rhythms and melodies that are more appealing to the average human.
Absolutely.
And this actually comes down to a very psychological animal kind of thought, you know. And I've actually read several books on music psychology that I would encourage any of our listeners to go and look into that topic, because you'll learn a lot, because there really is a more scientific aspect to it than you'd think. And I know that this is probably like heresy to a lot of our listeners and a lot of music enthusiasts, because a lot of people don't want to destroy that magic. A lot of people don't want to dive into it from too intellectual or scientific of an angle, because they just like what they like. And I would say that's fine. That's perfectly fine. But, if you're like Jake and I, and you want to know why, and you want to continue to question yourself, question your own motives, your own biases, your own reasonings behind liking or not liking something, then I think it's a really good topic to look into. But, that's something I don't want to get too much more in the weeds on. I think that it's just enough to say that, for me, I really do think that certain chord progressions and melody combinations, especially once you get harmony in there, once you get, some items like song structure, repetition. I think that those can exist completely independently from performance style, from production, from instrumentation, which actually I just kind of listed off a bunch of other aspects that we'll probably want to dive into, but I see songwriting as separate from that.
Absolutely. So like in our discussions over the years, Tom, we've often just used songwriting as a loose definition,
kind of a catch-all.
As a catch-all.
Phrase, yeah.
And so I wanted to break it down. Like so to me, it comes down to the following attributes: vocals, instrumentation, structure, chord progressions, melody and harmony, rhythm, and dynamics.
Yeah.
When I say the word or phrase songwriting, I mean those attributes, and a lot of things that are implied there, like when you talk about the complexity of a song, or the instrumental variety, or the intensity of a song.
Yeah,
that's all bottled up in those attributes of songwriting. Now, what's not in that is things like the production.
Yeah,
which include like mixing, sound choice, samples, other production flourishes used to enhance a song. What's also not included is like that high level X factor that we've talked about over the years, which is the charm of an album, or other external factors affecting your listening experience, like artist legacy and buzz around a certain album. For instance, like David Bowie just released his first, or his I think it's like his 25th studio record.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, in just last Friday, and it's Black Star. I listened to it this morning and I thought it was good, but I mean, people are raving about it because it's David Bowie. The artist
Would they be raving about it if it was Joe Lulu Pants, who had never been heard of before?
Yep, and a lot of people have argued to us, actually, Tom, over the years, that those external factors do affect your listening experience, whether you want them to or not. I would say that we have done our best to try to block them, but they're right. Like they do affect us, but that does add to that X factor, those external things that are just affecting the listening experience.
Yeah, it definitely adds to that, and something that I would put. It kind of comes into play with the artist legacy and hype, but I would say historical significance. Some people want to give albums, I think, a higher level of acclaim simply because they've had an impact, simply because they've had 30 or 40 years to stew around in people's minds. But, there's something to be said for that, and that can make a great influential record. But I really think that great music and a great album should transcend time. I think that if it's that good, maybe you can't measure its impact right away, but its quality should not necessarily be contingent on what comes after it. And how people interpret it 10 or 15 years from now. Yeah, that can measure social impact and influence, but I don't, the album's not changing. The music itself is not changing. Right. And I think that we need to be able to acknowledge great music when it comes out and not have to wait 20 years to measure its impact, because the music doesn't change. We do.
Yeah. A good example of that is well, first of all, the Beatles.
Yeah.
The Beatles music is timeless. I listen to the Beatles. We've been listening to the Beatles a lot lately, Tom, and their music is just as fresh today as it was in the late 60s when they were writing it. And on the opposite end of that, Kendrick Lamar's 2015 his 2015 record To Pimp a Butterfly, we questioned whether or not it will reach legendary status. We think it will.
Yeah.
Only time will tell, but I think that you can see enough of these qualities that we're talking about, that he's exemplifying how to do it perfectly in the hip hop genre, that you can make the argument very, very distinctly that this To Pimp a Butterfly will become a legendary hip hop record.
I totally agree.
Other attributes that we're thinking about when we talk about a perfect listening experience or a perfect album listening experience is like concept driving the record. Also, the general mood of the record, which some would say, I think you can make an argument that that's involved in the songwriting, just the general strategy around like, how am I going to structure this record? How am I going to make the sound? How am I going to approach creating the sound of the record? Is it going to be more mood based, or is it going to be more, like instrumental variety based?
Well, I think that something like originality and mood is really a cross section of songwriting and presentation or production.
Absolutely.
Because you can write a song that sounds like it's been done dozens of times before, but if you present it and produce it a little bit differently, it can sound original.
Yep.
And you can also use that tactic to evoke a mood that, maybe it's even in contrast to the core of the songwriting. And that contrast, something can be said for that. There's so many ways to do that I see those as being factors that really tie in some of those other attributes.
So you mentioned originality.
Yeah.
To me, that is something that is extremely important when I'm listening to music. If the sound isn't original, I am immediately turned off by it.
Yeah.
And lately, in the past few years, there's been a nostalgia, like 70s neo psychedelic music resurgence almost.
Yeah.
And a lot of bands have come out, like the ones that come to the top of mind are like Tame Impala, Foxygen. I'm sure there's many others.
Yeah.
But they all are using that throwback sound from like the mid 70s psychedelic rock movements. And I think a lot of those, like inherently, your sound, if you're in that subgenre, is not that original.
Yeah.
Because it's all been done before. You're using a lot of the musical themes and motifs that the artists back in the 70s did, and I think you're adding like those artists, they strategically need to go after a new spin on it.
Right.
But if they don't establish that spin and just default to the inherent sound of that genre, they're never going to be legendary. Their albums are never going to be anything special. People might like them, they might sell well, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be legendary.
Yeah. Another genre that I think is being done to death right now, Jake, is that whole like indie folk revival that somehow moved into the pop mainstream.
Thanks, Mumford and Sons.
Mumford and Sons, artists like Ed Sheeran, which is, a little more around the acoustic singer-songwriter pop kind of realm. But man, I'm just getting sick of that. Like there's nothing more to be said. And I will say, I think that this is an area where, while for me, lyrics aren't as big a part of the listening experience, lyrics shouldn't be crappy, but they don't need to be Bob Dylan in order for me to like it.
Right.
So still though, in that genre, you get these lyrical tropes and motifs and cliches, I should say, that come up so often that it just ruins it for me. You have all these songs in that kind of style that are either protest songs, breakup songs, love songs. They're not trying to say anything deeper than those kind of personal things, which really, actually, I should say, protest songs can be somewhat profound if they're done right. But they've been done to death. They just have. Write about something a little more all-encompassing, write about something that hits a little bit more home for the average listener. I don't know.
Or approach it creatively.
Right.
Like the ultimate protest song to me is Alice's Restaurant.
Yeah.
Like to me, I can't think of a better protest song because it's so creative in how it lulls you in.
It's poignant.
It tells you a story. It's funny. It's very long. So you devote time. I mean, like you have skin in the game. If you're going to listen to a 25-minute long song,
Right.
you have skin in the game, right? So you want to hear what the whole point is, and he doesn't play his whole cards until the end of the song. So I think that really is the ultimate protest song.
It makes a statement. It's satire.
Yeah.
And it does. It pulls you into it.
Yeah, the point is you have to do it right.
Yeah.
And in whatever you do when you're creating music, and Tom, you can probably relate to this as a studio artist, is when you create an album, you are thinking big picture of how can I make this album great?
Yeah.
And a lot of those attributes that we've talked about play into that, and how you approach it. Obviously, it reflects your own musical taste of how you interpret each one of those individual factors. And then you strategize around and build your music around how, like, maximizing each of those individual factors to make the sum something greater.
Sure.
And that's your approach.
Yeah. So and that's a great point, and I want to bring that back to the originality point. And I want to get on a soapbox for a moment.
Soapbox away, my friend.
This is something that pisses me off that people talk about all the time, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, Jake. But when it comes to originality, I think that a lot of artists just cop out. They just fall flat and they don't try, and this is something that you'll hear all the time is, well, nothing's really original. Everything that could be done has been done.
That's BS.
And to those people, I say bullshit. That's a cynical, crappy, nihilistic way to look at music. This is art, and no two people will approach art and expression the same way. No two people will sing a song the same way, will write a song the same way. Now, it is a spectrum. It's not just as black and white as it's original or it's unoriginal. I think that there is a spectrum there, and some things stray more into their own territory than others, which might have some kind of rehashed stuff. But, we're not asking for the moon here. We're not asking for the most unique thing ever. But every year, albums come out that find a way to make things fresh. Even in 2015, even in 2016, people will continue to push the envelope forward. And for people to say that everything that could be done has been done, people were saying that 20 years ago as well.
Well, also, it just shows how naive they are.
Right.
And it just shows that they probably don't listen to enough music. They probably aren't really being honest with themselves if they ask themselves, am I really searching for, and am I pursuing the quest to find new music intensely enough that I can actually justify saying that?
Right.
And the answer is no, they can't, because Tom, you and I find, there's people out there that listen to way more music than we do.
Yeah.
We are listening to a ton of music and all the different things that we do for this podcast, for like just our own personal experiences, for Music League, which seems to be this ongoing extracurricular we're in. And, we're constantly listening to new music and trying to evaluate and find new music that we like. And, it's out there. Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly is a great example of how you can make hip hop original.
Yeah.
An album that I liked from last year that you didn't, Tom, was Mutant's Arca.
Yeah.
Or the other way around. Arca's Mutant.
Gotcha.
But that was a way that you could do electronic music in a whole new way.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm looking for is artists who can push the envelope a bit.
You have to have faith in the artistic capabilities of the human race. Once you lose faith in that, then really what is the point of pursuing art and expression in any capacity? Because the thing is, everyone's going to have their influences.
Well, and as a humanist, I fundamentally believe that there is no limit to that.
Right. Exactly. You kind of have to, and I'm right there with you, Jake. But I think that everyone's going to have their influences. You can listen to a band that you consider to be unique and original. So let's take, for example, what I consider to be a true masterpiece. It's in my top 5 albums of all time. One of the most original works of music I've ever listened to, Beck's Odelay. That album,
I thought you were going to say Captain Beefheart.
That's up there as well. But Beck's Odelay, I think, is a masterpiece, and I have never heard anything that sounds remotely like it. But if you pick it apart, there are genres in there. You can hear what his influences are. You can hear some of his folk influences. You can hear some of his hip-hop influences.
Right.
And, the samples that he's pulling in, of course. But it packages it together in a way that you can have an album with 50 different variables of influence that no one of them is unique, but the combination of them is unique.
Right.
And that's what I'm looking for when I say originality. And there is no limit to the different permutations and combinations that you can make with that. There just isn't. So anyone who says that, no, shame on you. You got to have a more open mind and a wider approach when thinking about originality.
So of all these different attributes we've talked about, Tom, one of the things that we approach, or one of our theories of how we approached evaluating music early on, which I think has stayed true over the years, is that all of these, if you're evaluating all of these different attributes at an individual level, then you obviously have to compare that against how you inherently let each of those attributes affect your listening experience. So, Tom, can you just summarize for us, and I'll do the same, just what's important to you when listening to music? Which of these attributes do you care about, and which do you care about a little bit less?
Sure. For me, it's a lot about songwriting. For me, it's about songwriting and that kind of X factor you talked about, which I kind of think of as that emotional appeal. I really want to feel it. But to me, the
charm, the warmth,
right. Make me care. Sell it to me. You got to really make me care, and that's really what pulls me in. But the thing for me is, I think that some people listen to music more emotionally, and some people listen to music more intellectually. I think a lot of people who like some more technical, like prog metal bands, like maybe even like Rush for old school, but newer stuff like Dream Theater and maybe like Opeth. People are maybe a little more intellectually driven. They like thinking and analyzing the time signatures and rhythms and chord structures.
Or just how the heck can someone finger a guitar like
right,
that?
Right, exactly. They're impressed by the technical acumen that goes into that. Whereas, on the other side of that, I think, there's punk music and I would say even like dance music and a lot of modern electronica that, not that it's void of intellectual aspects, especially in punk music. I think the lyrics bring a lot of intellectualism if you're listening to the right bands. But it's more about the energy, just the raw energy going into it. You don't necessarily want to have to overthink it. For me, I like both of those sides of things, but for different reasons. And to me, a lot of the best bands can balance those two. And I can look at their songwriting, I can dissect the way that they're structuring rhythms and chords and melodies and harmony and dynamics. And I can take that and realize how they're putting those building blocks together in creating that X factor and creating that emotional appeal, because I think that there's a recipe for it that they're using to achieve that end result. And I find that really interesting. For me, some of the things that maybe aren't quite as important is, general intensity level. I'm pretty wide on that. I know some people who won't listen to anything more rocking than, Nirvana. And I know some people who won't listen to anything less rocking than Pantera. Some people just have biases like that. I really don't. I'm also not as much a stickler on lyrics. Jake, you mentioned our Music League earlier, and in our last week of Music League, we had it was no English lyrics. You had to submit stuff that had vocals but was in another language or maybe just some kind of mouth sounds. And there was one guy in our league, Rick, and Rick was telling me, like, I hate this week because lyrics are the entry point to a song for me. Lyrics mean way more to Rick than they do to me, because for me, like, I don't care. They come secondary. I don't want them to suck because that can ruin the listening experience. But like I said earlier, they don't have to be Bob Dylan level quality. They don't have to be poetry. They just have to not work against the music.
Yeah. And I would say that's an interesting, the phrase entry point is very interesting, because I think we all naturally have entry points or things that we gravitate towards first. Mine is for sure originality. If I hear something that it's like, whoa, I've never heard something like that before. Ooh,
gets your
that's
attention.
interesting. Yeah. I'm in, and I want to hear more. And then I start transcending into those other attributes and evaluating those individual attributes. But if something comes off, and it's just, something rehashed, like if it sounds like Creed, I hate it instantly. and that's totally my entry point. But like things that I care about, Tom, originality is number one. That's my entry point. But then after that, songwriting's up there, just like you said, and something that I've harped on over the years, and I would say this is a sub-attribute to songwriting, is song structure. Yeah. If you put every song on your record as good as well performed and as all of those other attributes, if those were all maxed out, if every single song on your album is verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, I will hate the record. Yeah. It's just it will wear thin. It's been proven time and time again to me by albums that have done this. I think that's just an act of an artist lacking creativity and relying too much on a formula.
So you bring up a great point here with song structure. Something I want to point out is, the topic of today's podcast is what makes an album great. I want to point out that song structure across an album, as you just defined it, is actually the first attribute that we've talked about that is exclusive to albums and not just single songs. Right. So things like songwriting, production, originality, that X factor, you could look and assess an individual track on all of those levels. So how do we apply that to the album as a bigger picture? Because, we talked about production as well. Some people are sensitive to production. I actually, on a song level, am of the opinion that there's really no wrong way to go with production, as long as you're playing to the strengths of the song.
It has to match. It has to match the songwriting style.
The style, right? But I think that once you apply that to an album view, listening to an entire album, nothing kills an album for me like listening through the whole thing and feeling like it was produced inconsistently, like there were too many cooks in the kitchen, like there's not consistency in the way that they decided to package and present the sound. That's something that I get with a lot of hip-hop albums these days, because they do have like 6 producers working on different songs. And if you can't take that and make it sound like something smooth and flowing, then it's going to really disrupt the album listening experience for me. It just kills it. So, that's one thing as well. Song structure you mentioned. I don't think there's anything wrong with a verse, chorus, bridge, chorus song on an individual level.
Right.
But you're absolutely right, Jake. If you throw 12 of those right back to back on an album, it gets stale.
Absolutely. Other things I care about are album structure, how well an album flows from the moment you turn it on till the moment that the album ends. Generally, I like albums that just inherently flow well, that I can put it on, listen to the entire thing, and it goes through in the album. The songs play off of one another. There's usually a climactic point or points to the album, and the album closes nicely. The songs might transition into one another very fluidly, and they're usually and almost always, there are no dead songs on the album, no filler tracks. If I have to skip a track, it's probably a sign of poor album structure.
I think that's a good point that we haven't really brought up. It's kind of the first obvious answer to what makes an album great. It's great songs.
Right.
You got to have great songs.
Got to have great songs.
But I also would argue that you don't have to have every song be perfect on its own to have a perfect album. This isn't a perfect analogy, but does every scene in a movie have to be perfect on its own to make a great movie?
Right.
No, I don't think it does.
They have to play off of one another.
Right. It has to. You will naturally have some moments that are stepping stones between the highlights, the climaxes, and so on. And I think of albums as being the same way. There are some tracks on my favorite albums that I would never necessarily want to listen to on their own, but I can't imagine listening to that album without it.
Yeah.
One example I would pull is 9 Inch Nails' Downward Spiral, the track Big Man with a Gun. I'm never going to go out of my way to listen to that track. But its placement in the album, the energy it brings, the way that it transitions from the track before it to the track after it.
The different segments of that individual record.
Right, exactly. And I could pull almost any of my favorite records out of the air and find a track or two that I feel that way about.
So other aspects of albums, other attributes that I don't care about as much are intensity, just intensity level of an album. An album can be super intense, and I might love it. An album can be absolutely slow and moving, and given the right mood, the right circumstance, and how all the other attributes are implemented, I might still love the album. It doesn't need to be super intense. A good example is like the XX, their first record. I remember liking that record, and the reason it was very, very slow moving. It was not intense at all, and I still loved it because they did so much else with the music that was original, that was the lyrics were intriguing, the vocal performances I thought were spot on for the mood that it was going for. It had great mood. A lot of the melodies that they presented there, while sparse, were very impactful.
Yeah.
So it's just a good example of how intensity doesn't really matter to me. It can be a wide range of intensities, and I'll love it. The other is technical complexity. I personally don't need something to be very technically complex, especially in the instrumentation or time signatures, for me to love it. The song, what I don't like is repetition. What I don't like is the same idea being rehashed over and over again without any variety. And I think that's the key thing. One of the key things that I look into is variety, and also dynamics. I think dynamics make up such a huge, it adds the contrast that you need to really establish great songwriting. It's a sub-attribute of songwriting for sure. But without good dynamics, without great contrast, both instrumentally and then in volume, I think that songs fall flat.
Yeah. You mentioned that dynamic level and that intensity level, and as you were talking through that, I realized that I think I might be actually a little more sensitive to that than you. Frankly, because, a couple albums come to mind that we reviewed back in the day, Jake, that I even really liked, but I didn't like quite as much as I could. And those two albums were Fiona Apple's The Idler Wheel and PJ Harvey's Let England Shake. I love PJ Harvey's Let England Shake. But both of those albums, I feel like Fiona Apple and PJ Harvey get to a point where they're at like a 9 out of 10 with the intensity level, and I just wanted them to burst through that ceiling and get to 10, and they just didn't quite do it. Like this tension is building, but it never really comes to its full fruition, right? And that's something, you mentioned the XX. I don't need that out of the XX, because when I start listening to that, I'm not given the expectation that it will ever get to that point. But in an album, when tension starts to build and I never really feel like it has that release, it does bother me a little bit, because it's a climax that I expect to have at some point.
Hey man, everybody needs their release.
Thanks for making me feel like a perv on our podcast.
What are some other albums that you would consider great, that maybe like there's canonical albums that everyone thinks are great? I guess let's exclude those.
Okay.
What are some albums that maybe not everyone thinks are great that we think are great?
That we think are great.
I got one off the top of my head.
Go for it.
Monomona's Friend and Foe.
Absolutely.
That of all these qualities that we're talking about, that album absolutely exemplifies how to do this right, how to be a great album. And I feel like that's such a quietly great record. Not many people even listen to Monomona.
Right.
And that record, it was their second record. It came out in, I think, 2007. Is so unknown.
It succeeds on all counts, though.
But in my mind, like, it's one of the best records I've ever heard. Every time I listen to it, I'm just blown away by how good those guys executed that record.
One that isn't underappreciated. Well, actually, I've got a couple now that I think of it.
I'm sure we could come up with an infinite list.
Dredge's El Cielo.
Okay.
Dredge is not a band you hear about a lot.
Another second album.
Yeah, El Cielo is an album you don't hear about a lot. To me, it is a perfect concept album. On the things that we were talking about, Jake, it's got some transition tracks that help the album flow. It has that album structure and the forethought of how everything was planned out. The instrumentation is very well performed and very diverse.
Yeah.
They bring a lot of different instrumentals into it without it sounding cluttered. It still sounds smooth. It's original. It's not really like any other rock album I've heard, both in instrumental approach and also the vocalist. He just has a very unique voice. I mean, everything that we're talking about here, that album to me succeeds in. It really pulls me in. It's a truly emotional experience throughout, and I've never heard anything else like it.
That's a really good example I didn't originally think of. Okay, Tom, another example that we've talked about in the past in other podcasts and in music reviews is Death Cab for Cuties, another second album. We have the facts and we're voting yes.
Yeah.
I think that record, it's incredibly indie. It's nothing like Death Cab of today. In fact, Death Cab of today is a very poor representation of what I think. Their recent records are a very poor representation of what I think a great album is.
Yeah.
But We Have the Facts is absolutely an example of a great record. You have a very nice album structure. First of all, it's a very original sound. There's not many. There's not even in the world of lo-fi produced indie albums of the late 90s and early 2000s, like, you really didn't have a lot of music out there that sounded like Death Cab, and I will give Chris Walla and Ben Gibbard credit for that. No one has guitar melodies and guitar sound like Chris Walla does. He's very unique in his approach to writing guitar melodies. And the other thing is Ben Gibbard's voice is inherently unique, and his approach to writing lyrics is so creative, even today in the modern Death Cab, that there's just initial appeal. He adds warmth just in how he approaches his vocal melodies and his lyrics.
Yeah.
And so that certainly brings that X factor in. But then also, I think you have a lot of like really nice instrumentation. The album structure and the song structure is varied, and the songs flow into one another. There's two distinct sections of that album. The lyrics play off of one another, and they reference different songs. So there's this connection between all the songs. There's an underlying concept that isn't super obvious, but once you start digging at the lyrics, it's all connected together. A lot of the same musical songwriting motifs are used throughout the album, so it's not like the smorgasbord of different songs. It's very cohesive. And you have great rhythm and great dynamics. That album keys in on dynamics so well that it really makes the album listening experience memorable. Overall, that's like one of the most perfect records.
Yeah.
And it's not considered legendary, but to me, it's one of the best records I've ever heard.
Yeah. I think it's worth going through maybe one or two examples of some albums everyone knows that fits this mold, just so we have a good point of reference. Because some of these albums, we're going with our obscure picks and justifying those, but I'd like to get some out there just to get people thinking and having a reference point. One, I would say, is Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd.
Everyone loves Dark Side of the Moon.
Everyone loves Dark Side of the Moon. It's one of the most unlikely popular albums of all time. I mean, it's sold so many copies, and really when you think about it, it's an odd kind of prog rock record. But the key to me that makes it a great record is you hear people talking about Dark Side of the Moon more than you hear them talking about any one song from Dark Side of the Moon.
That's right. It's an album.
It is an album experience, and that's what makes it a great album. Now, the albumization, the flow between tracks, how they're connected, that's one thing. The lyrical themes of human isolation and yearning, something that is relatable to everyone at a very instinctual level. And also just the instrumentation. It's varied, it's well performed, it's unique. It has a lot of dynamic high and low points. I mean, especially when you get to the end with Brain Damage and Eclipse. Oh my God. I mean, the whole album just explodes. And I mean, it's an undisputed masterpiece. I know a lot of people even think that there are some Pink Floyd albums better than that. It's not everyone's favorite for the diehard fans, and that's understandable.
But it is a great record.
But it is a great record. I don't think anyone would say it's bad.
And if they did, I'd love to have that argument because I think it's really hard to argue against it. I'd be curious to what the counterpoints are,
Right.
Another record, another classic album is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. 1967 is when that came out. And Tom, we're actually going to talk about that record here in a couple weeks. Since the Beatles music is now on Spotify, Tom and I are huge fans of Spotify. And,
Celebration.
Yep. So we're actually, the next 2 weeks, the next two podcasts following this one, we'll be talking about the Beatles in an artist deep dive. We'll do part 1 will be the Beatles early years through Revolver, and then part 2 will be Revolver through, I guess, whatever you consider to be their last record, whether that's Let It Be or Abbey Road.
Yeah.
So we'll be talking about that very soon in more detail, but Sgt. Pepper at a high level is commonly considered one of the greatest records of all time.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, it's got everything we just talked about. It's got variety while still sounding cohesive, which is a very hard balance to achieve. It certainly was original in 1967, and I think it remains that way today.
Definitely.
It employs a sheer mastery of the instrumentals that the Beatles were using. Good variety. I mean, it had it all. I'm just going to start repeating myself at some point now.
Yep. So to sum it all up, Tom, what are some of the things that all great albums have?
Well, I'll revisit what I just said about Sgt. Pepper. I think that there's a balance of variety while still sounding consistent and cohesive. That's a very difficult balance to achieve because you don't want it to sound stale, but you don't want all the tracks to sound like they shouldn't be on the same album together. That's very difficult. To me, also, you've got to have consistent production that goes along with it. You have to have good performances. You have to have mixing and production that complements the songwriting and performance styles. I think you could have a well-performed album that just isn't mixed or produced appropriately that really kills it. But one other thing that we haven't mentioned as much is just commitment to your sound and performance. I hate hearing an artist that I feel like they're not even convinced of what they're doing. Even if it's not perfect, if I feel like the person is all in on it, just 100% going for it, they believe what they're singing, what they're playing, then I am much more likely to enjoy it at that point.
The Joy Formidable comes to mind when you mention that.
Yeah.
They're 100% all in on their sound, and while I'm not the hugest fan of that artist, I mean, like, those guys really commit to the sound, and I think that's what the appeal is. So great for their sound.
Sure.
Other aspects I think that all great albums have is just great songwriting, starting with great instrumentation, writing great instrumental parts, whatever instrumental variety they use, having great structure to the songs, and dynamics.
Yeah.
I think dynamics are key. And to me, I think originality is very important. So certainly for Velocities in music, those attributes I think really are the first things we look at when we're saying what makes an album great. And I do believe that this pursuit is one that we may never find the perfect record. I know you and I both love Nine Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral.
Yeah.
And a number of the other records we mentioned today all are all up there as like the perfect album, and but I don't think we've yet heard that, right? Like every year we discover a new gem that it's like this is like one of the best records of the year. I'm going to listen to this for the rest of my life and love it. And it usually exemplifies all these qualities, right? And you know, I'm excited to find that record for 2016 and future years.
Yeah.
But who knows if that's going to be the best record of all time.
Yeah.
I think fundamentally you can't find the best record of all time. You can just find truly great albums.
Right, for yourself.
So, Tom, I think we've adequately covered the attributes and a description of what we define as a great album, and we've tried to at least approach what we're looking for when we try to answer the question, what makes an album great?
Yeah.
And obviously that's going to vary for any one of you guys listening out there, but it's certainly... Tom and I have worked on this over the years, and we feel pretty strongly that if you're breaking an album listening experience down to those individual attributes, looking at those attributes and comparing them against your own preferences, that you're naturally going to be able to assess and argue for liking a particular album more, and it helps answer the question if an album to you is great. And so that's something that we actually feel very strongly about here. So I'm curious for you guys out there, what are some attributes to a great album listening experience that we may have missed, and which are most important to you guys? Also, we named a number of our favorite records, or records that we think are great albums that may or may not have been known by most people. What are some albums you consider to be great that maybe not everybody has heard before? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, you can visit velocitiesinmusic.com for a list of the artists we discussed today on our podcast, and we'll also provide links to their Spotify pages. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, Facebook messages, and emails. We try to do our best to keep up and respond on all these, but we definitely appreciate your participation because that is what makes Velocities in Music possible. So as always, thanks for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.